It's a new year. And at the outside of every new year, we believe that maybe, just maybe, the dawn of a new year means that there could be changes in us, around us, and in our world. Occasionally, we're gratified to see big, sweeping changes at the end of a year. But more often than not, our disappointments are in direct proportion to the grandeur which we anticipated at the outset. If we look closely, however, we'll see multiple small, hopeful signs, when put together, make for a great reason for gratitude. And I hope that's where you and I find ourselves this morning. In the fall of 2020, a meme started on Twitter that quickly gained traction. People began tweeting how it started, how it's going, then included initial pictures, sometimes from years, even decades prior, and then pictures from the present. Sandra E. Garcia of the New York Times writes, "The basic concept is to show the passage of time to oppositional bookends." The best versions of this meme is about remembering journeys and implying how much work and time it took from getting from point A to point B. And here we'll see the first slide. I'm fascinated by this one. It's a picture of a 13-year-old Amy McGrath petitioning her then and current Senator Mitch McConnell to change the law so that women could be fighter pilots. He didn't reply, writes McGrath, who trained to become the first woman Marine to fly a combat mission in an F/A-18. Her next picture is a poster announcing debate night with her and Senate Majority Leader McConnell on the picture. There are how it started photos of prom nights, and then how it's going photos of a couple with a couple of kids. Or in our next slide, photos of emaciated animals which are rescued, and then the next picture, how it's going, shows their happy forever homes. And then the biggest surprise of all, this morning I saw on Facebook the perfect example of the how it started, how it's going, and thank you to Linda Baird, the next one. There you have it, how it started, how it's going, and it's still going strong, we see. We're fascinated by these pictures. We love interesting stories. For the coming weeks, we'll look at Jesus's life, teaching, and message, taking the structure of how it started and how it's going. All along, we'll emphasize the journey, the nitty-gritty work that requires to get from point A to point B. The Apostle John, like any good writer, builds a foundation upon which to write his version of the Jesus story. The foundation, the how it started section, begins quite cryptically, however. What John writes is hard for us to understand. Maybe it was easier for his listeners, his original audience, who heard and read these words in their own language, in their own context. But the use of word is confusing for us. For us, a word is a combination of letters that can read or be verbalized to construct meaning, to describe, to build an argument, to weave a story. Exactly what you're hearing here now. The word in this context has been discussed and explained and disputed over centuries. In Greek, the word is logos, and the Hebrew translation of the Bible to Greek uses the word rhema for word. Logos is defined as a principle originating in classical Greek thought. It refers to a universal divine reason. Rhema means an utterance or something said. That's how it's used in Greek philosophy. If all of this sounds complicated, it's because it is complicated. And yet, word is repeated no fewer than 14 times in these 18 verses. It seems key to having any insight into the story that John wants to tell about Jesus. So we best try to understand it. If we were to substitute another word for the word word, what would that word be? And just by asking that question, you realize how complex it is to use that word in this story or in this foundation. One of the most understandable explanations for the use of word or logos or rhema is Richard Rohr's use of the descriptive words code breaker or blueprint. When I read that interpretation some years ago, it absolutely revolutionized this passage for me. Let me give you just a couple of examples. And I've chosen predominantly to use code breaker throughout this morning. You may want to use blueprint. It's interchangeable and equally valid. So here goes. In the beginning, there was the code breaker. The code breaker was present to God from the beginning. The code breaker came into the world, but the world didn't recognize it. The code breaker came and became one of us and stayed a little while among us. The code breaker was filled with grace and truth. Code breakers have fascinating minds because their assignments are a mystery. Did you know that the NSA has an annual code breaking competition? Possibly some of you read about the international team of code breakers who have recently deciphered the code of Zodiac 340 cipher, breaking the code a San Francisco serial killer used 51 years ago. We find codes and therefore code breakers fascinating. If you're dealing with a code, it means nothing until you understand it. The code breaker is one who can interpret and unlock this code, making a mystery universally understandable. Notice that the writer John doesn't use the word Jesus or the Christ at the beginning of the text. That happens much later. At the outset, he lays a foundation. It's as if he wants his audience to think in different, out of the ordinary terms so that they won't get bogged down with their own well-worn stereotypes. Now, if John's readers were already in danger of entrenched ideas of who Jesus was, how much more are we in that danger after millennia of interpretation? The very first words that Armando read were words of origin. Did that strike you? In the beginning. The same words used in our first origin story describing the genesis of the cosmos. In the beginning, God, we read in Genesis 1. Both texts have how it started language. This parallel isn't an accident. What often escapes us is that the code breaker that is unveiled in the John account was very much part of the first original origin story of our scriptures. This code breaker who coexisted with God, John says, embodies life. Life which became humanity's light. This light of the code breaker shines in the darkness. In fact, it's a light which the darkness has never been able to overtake. Twice during this section of character development, John injects a short break in programming to say, listen, this code breaker is not me. It's someone who existed before me and is so far beyond me. Don't confuse the messenger with the one who is glory and grace and truth. We are not synonymous. John is building something here. He wants to be certain that his readers understand exactly whom he's talking about before he moves into the journey part of the how it started, how it's going scenario. Then come further clues about who this code breaker might be. Notice the sequence and progression in the text. John states that the code that was planted into the world initially in the first origin story was greatly misunderstood, went largely unrecognized, and remained unaccepted by most, even though nature, creation, and the explosion of the cosmos could never have occurred without the infusion of this code into every atom, every fiber of all that came into existence. There would have been no design, no impotence without it. There seems to have been enormous confusion about both God and the natural world since the beginning of time as we know it. Even though the code had been embedded in this natural realm from the beginning, some saw, they recognized the presence of the code. They understood the sacredness of everything that housed this code. But since many did not see, they began to develop their own structures of how-tos, how to live, how to think, how to interpret the world, how to worship. It reminds me of the internet sensation featuring the blue and the gold dress from a couple of years back. Do you remember that? Some saw the dress in question as unmistakably blue, and then others argued vehemently that it was definitely gold. There will always be those who see, or those who see differently, or those who don't see at all, for whatever reason. But the purpose of an incarnation is for more light, more clarity, an effort to make the code more graspable. Even before John names the Christ as the most recent incarnation, the one who further breaks this code, he can't help but exult in the change that comes over people who see. Those whose vision is expanded, like those who saw the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. It is these who see and grasp who are empowered to be children of God, participants in what's been unlocked. This was no induction into an exclusive club, just an empowerment to participate in whatever purpose the designer had for the code. But there eventually came the time where the designer, the divine designer, saw the necessity of sending a more relatable presence to a seemingly dull humanity. Would humanity recognize in another human being what it could not see in the natural world? Would the code breaker be able to make the interpretation of the code more plain? It seems the answer is yes, partially, but still with limited response. Some found the combination that unlocked the code, seeing how this code bound them to one another, to all of creation, and to every and each created thing, all held within the warming and streaming light of God. When the code breaker came to participate in life on this planet, the understandable, relatable human form taken was Jesus, born to a young woman and her carpenter husband from Nazareth. The code breaker became flesh or human for a short time. It's then that humanity could see the glory, the grace, the truth that was embedded inside this code from a different angle. It began to make more sense to those who found the first incarnation hard to grasp. Those who'd been buried under the human struggle and encroaching human competition and control and confrontation. The finale in this text comes when John makes the absolute link between the code breaker and Jesus the Christ. Yes, there were clues prior to this, but the gift, the truth, and the unlocking of the code has now come to us as the code breaker. I know this is some deep theology, difficult to wade through, yet bringing an aliveness hardly conceivable without digging for it. This is the hard mental and spiritual work to prepare us for the journey between the how it started and the how it's going. So why is all of this important? First of all, the profound understanding of the Christ or the code breaker is significant. His existence prior to his brief human tenure on this planet meant the code breaker was present from the beginning, and the code was infused into the origin of our cosmos. The same code that was housed in the human form as Jesus the Christ. Second, there's a reason for Jesus having come to earth, the one who housed the Christ for 33 years. Jesus, the man, not only carried the code within himself, he unlocked, he explained, and he embodied it. We have just celebrated the event that reminded us of Emmanuel, God with us. This passage introduces the same Jesus as the code breaker, builds on that Emmanuel revelation, assuring us that God is always and will always be with us. All of us and the entire natural world carries this divinely embedded code within us. And thirdly, the intention of God was never to confuse, but to unlock. If spirituality or religious form becomes too burdensome, too complicated, too weighted down with form or ritual or regulation, it serves more as a locking than an unlocking. With both the original incarnation in nature and the incarnation of the code breaker as Jesus of Nazareth, the clues are profound and prolific. We begin to see the code breaker everywhere. How does that impact us? Because of the code breaker, we can begin to understand the divine nature within the human person of Jesus. Because of the code, we are tied to nature in its origin and its continued extraordinary explosion. Because of the code breaker, we can begin to understand that every one of us, all of nature, every atom of the cosmos is linked because of the code that was placed within us, the code that the code breaker came to reveal. Therefore, we have enormous value. We carry the divine code within us. Therefore, because of our unity based on this code placed within us, the code breaker calls us to respect each human being on this planet, from the unsheltered masses on our city streets, to the primitive mountain tribes, to family, neighbors, and friends, to arrogant, corrupt connivers of colonizing cultures, all of us. Therefore, there is hope. This code breaker's light shines in the darkness, and it can never be overtaken, never extinguished, never. This passage has given me hope this week. Now think about it. If how it started already awakens hope, can you just imagine what's going to happen when we really get into the how it's going section? Amen.